Greetings and welcome to From the Basement. In this video, we're going to get some functionality put in for the Galactic mailer project. First, just want to do a quick point out here that I did load some things off camera. We won't need them for this video, but do get them loaded in. Spec moon, title, and I loaded in all of my sounds and background music. Now, nothing fancy, no special options or anything. Didn't feel it was worth spending camera time on. Alright, so let's get some moons and asteroids created. So we're going to go into Objects, Objects, Create Object. I'm going to call this Moon, start off with that. Set the sprite to the moon sprite. Now what do we want to have the moon do? As soon as the moon's created, we want it to start moving in a direction. So that would be in a create event. Now this time, instead of using move fixed, we're going to use move free. It would look a little bit weird if the moons and asteroids moved in, cardinal directions plus the diagonals. It would just look a little weird. So instead, we're going to use move free, which has a direction parameter or direction property that is in degrees. So 0 would be straight to the right, 90 would be straight up, so on and so forth. Now, it would be kind of weird if everything moved in the same direction, so we're going to have to use a function to randomize how things move. And appropriately enough, the function name is random. And now, programmer speak here, what's a function? You can think of a function as a series of steps that operates on data that you're going to want to do frequently. In this case, generating random numbers is quite a few steps if you actually look at random number generation code, and it's something you need to do frequently, so hence it gets put into a function. Now to use a function, you type in the function's name, in this case random, without any spaces. This is important. You put in an open parentheses, and then you need to put in whatever information that function needs. In the case of random, it needs a number, 360 in this case, and then you put in a close parentheses. Now, what does that number mean in terms of the random function? Well, random will generate a real number between 0 and 1 less of what you passed in. So in this case, it'll be between 0 and 359. And by real number, I mean it's a floating point decimal. Now, direction only wants an integer or a whole number. And what happens in GameMaker and in a lot of systems, if you take something that's a floating point decimal, try and stuff it into an integer, which is a whole number, it'll just simply drop the decimal component. So it's important to keep in mind, random does generate decimal numbers, not integers. And this will give us a range between 0 and 359, which works out perfectly for directions on a circle. And for speed, we'll just put that at 4. Now, going back to our mantra of computers are stupid, what do we want to have this object do when we hit the edge of a room? It would look kind of weird if we had the moons and asteroids bouncing off the edges of the room. It would look much better as in asteroids. As the object goes off the edge, it comes back in on the other side. Now, we're not going to be able to get that perfectly. Instead, what we're going to have is we'll have the moons fully leave one edge of the screen and then start coming back in on the opposite side. So for that, we're going to need an outside room event. And once the moon has completely left the edge, we're going to wrap it, which is this move command right here. It looks like 2 curved arrows. And we want to wrap in both directions. That is important. Then that finishes up the moon. Now, the asteroids are functionally identical to the moons, at least right now. So rather than doing all that work again, I'm just going to right-click on the moon, duplicate, rename this asteroid, change my sprite, and I'm done. Now let's create a room to put these guys in. So create room. I'm going to immediately go into the backgrounds tab. And I'm going to change from no background to stars and uncheck draw background color. Unchecking this is not necessary. It's just, there's no sense in having it draw the color if we're just going to put a background on top of it. Now for Galactic Mailer, I don't need this grid. It's actually kind of really in the way. So what I'm going to do is up here where we have our grid controls, I am going to click on this right here, which toggles off the grid. Now the grid is still there. I'll still snap things to the grid, I just don't see it. Now I'm going to go over into Objects, I'm going to grab a moon, and put down 4 moons, grab an asteroid, put down 4 asteroids, and we're good. Let's test this to see if this works. You don't need to close the room, by the way. That's just something I do because I don't have a lot of screen real estate right now. Now, the first time you do this, it's not going to compile as fast as mine has. I've already gone through this a couple of times. The first time you hit play on this, it's going to hesitate for a moment because it's got to compile all of these sound files and sprites into the proper GameMaker format. It will remember this, however, and it won't recompile them every time as long as it detects that there has been no changes to those resources. So that's why mine went a lot faster than yours will in the first time you hit the play button. Alright, so looks reasonable. Asteroids are spinning a little fast, but that's something we can fix a little bit later. Something we need to fix right now, though, is our ABCDs completely spazzing out on the moons. And somehow all of my moons are now on one spot, which is really odd. Okay, I'll take a look at that in a moment because I've never seen that behavior before. But let's fix the spazzing out on the animation first. I'm going to open this back up. And so in my create event, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to main 1, and I have some sprite actions here. One of them being set or change sprite. I'm going to drag over that change sprite. Now I'm not really going to change the sprite. I'm still going to set it to sprite moon. I'm going to leave it at sub image 0 for now. We'll come back to this later when the book deals with this. And for my speed, I'm going to set that to 0. We were going to have to do this anyways once we set up our ship flying. We're just sort of getting one step ahead. What the speed does is this controls how fast the moon animates. By setting it to 0, we're saying don't animate. Now if I run this, now they're all locked on A's, and this time they're behaving and not disappearing. So I don't know what it was with that first time, why all the moons but one disappeared, but they're behaving now. Alright, so let's go ahead and get our ships created. We're going to start off with ship landed. Now, I'm going to go ahead and create a placeholder for my ship flying because I'm going to need that for my ship landed at some point. So I'm just going to create my ship flying object, not do anything with it, just hit OK. Now, how the landed ship works is that when you land on a moon to deliver the mail, you're going to shift to a ship landed image, and you're going to basically sit on that moon while the moon drifts through space before launching off into another moon. And how we're going to do that is we're going to access the XY properties of the moon that we landed on. Now the problem with this is we can't say moon.x and moon.y because there's more than one moon. And when you've got more than one instance of an object in a room, and you refer to the object's name for properties, what GameMaker will do is it will pick the first object in the list, which is usually the last object created, and use it. And that is very unlikely to be the moon that we just landed on, so it'll look like our ship is teleporting to a different moon. Not good. So we need something else. we need a different moon object that behaves exactly like a moon, but is unique, so that way we can refer to its XY properties. The special moon, or spec moon as I like to call it. Now the reason why I had us create a special image for this is because it can be quite difficult to tell where your spec moon is excuse me, after you've placed it in the scene. So let's go ahead and get that created. Now it's effectively identical to a moon as far as its own behavior goes. So I am going to duplicate the moon, and I am going to just simply change its sprite and update its name. This is a spec moon, and I'm done. Now let's get the ship landed in here. So create object, ship landed, change my sprite. Now we've got the same issue here with the ship landed that we did with the moon. In fact, this is where you normally encounter this if you're following through the book exactly. The ship landed has animation properties to it. In fact, let me just go ahead and close out, go into the room here and drop in the ship landed. We're going to need them in there eventually anyways, and since I'm here, I'll also drop in a spec moon. So we've got the same issues in that the ship is just going to sit there and spin. We don't want it to do that. We want the ship to be still and not turning unless the player is making the ship turn. So we have to fix that. So we are going to do an add event step. Now this time we're going to do an in step. So I need to do a quick explanation about what the differences are between these steps. A step is going to happen regardless. That's sort of like the update loop of GameMaker. It's going to happen whatever your room speed is, which is by default 30 frames per second. And order is usually determined by the order in which game objects were created. Normally, order doesn't matter. Also, the step event phase is when you're going to be getting all of your keyboard inputs and mouse inputs and things like that. The begin step phase is saying, okay, we're ready to begin our step event. Does anybody want to go first? So this is a way of guaranteeing that you will process your actions before anybody else gets to process their actions. The end step is kind of the opposite. After everything else has finished with their step events, then you can run an end step event. This is the one that we want because we want to guarantee that the spec moon has made its update first. It's updated its position first before we have the ship jump to it. So we're going to hook into the end step event. And let's go ahead and do the jump first since we're in the move tab already. I'm going to drag the jump over. And I'm going to say specmoon.x. What am I doing here with this statement? And by the way, that dot, if you can't see it very well from the video, that is a period. It's very common in programmer speak to say, you know, variable name dot or object name dot variable name when you're using the dot syntax. So specmoon.x. Do not put spaces in there. You will get an error if you have a space around that dot, around that period. No spaces. So what am I doing here? Well, spec moon is the name of an object, and an object has properties. Where is your X position? Where is your Y position? What sprite are you using? What is your direction? What is your vertical speed? Your horizontal speed? All these different properties can be looked up on an object. If you are curious as to what those are, if you go to scripts, show built-in variables, all of these local variables are variables that, or properties that all objects have. So all objects have their own copy of an X, their own copy of a Y, a visible, a V speed, sprite height, index, width, offset, all sorts of fun stuff. Now in this list you also have global variables. Global variables are not unique to individual objects. all objects share these values. For example, FPS, frames per second. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense to have objects with individual FPS counters on them. That's just for the game itself. So I want to jump to specmoon.x and specmoon.y. Now to fix our animation problem, we go to main 1. We're going to change our sprite. Well, not really. We're still going to say that sprite landed. Now for our sub-image, we're going to use direction, which is one of those built-in variables. If you go back to look at the built-in variables, you'll see that yes, there is a direction variable in there. And we're going to divide that by 5. Remember, division is /. Now, since sub-image expects an integer, it's going to drop the decimal portion of our math. So 1 divided by 5 is 0. 2 divided by 5 is 0. 3 divided by 5 is 0. 4 divided by 5 is 0. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 6 divided by 5 is 1. So on and so forth. You get the idea. It's just simply going to drop the decimal. It will not round unless we actually use the round function, which we're not. And we will set our speed to 0 because we do not want this animating on its own. We are going to control this. And so we hit OK, and that should be enough changes for us to be able to test. And it works. Mostly. It's not animating anymore, which is a good thing, but our ship is kind of oddly placed on the moon. It's not centered. Oh, that is an origin problem. When we were loading in our images, we left our origins in the upper left-hand corners of the sprites, which is causing them to not look perfectly lined up. So to fix that, I'm going to go into Ship Landed, and I'm going to center the origin. And that looks pretty good. Okay. I'm also going to go into Sprite Flying, center the origin. Otherwise, we wouldn't see a small, like, shift or jump every time we launched. The moons and asteroids don't need their origins updated because we never do any movements relative to those, but SpecMoon does need its origin adjusted to the center. And upon doing all of that origin adjusting, and it's, I made a mistake, and I know precisely which mistake I made. Notice, this is not working at all, and my ship is now hovering off, but also notice it's not using the SpecMoon sprite right now. So, SpecMoon, oops, sorry. Ship landed, no, SpecMoon. Change sprite. I don't want to change it into a sprite moon. I want to change it into a sprite SpecMoon. Now it's working perfectly. I've got my ship sitting nice and perfectly centered on the moon. All right, let's get that ship moving then. Now, movement's going to be handled by the arrow keys. We're going to use the left and right arrow keys to adjust which direction the ship is pointing, and then the spacebar to launch the ship. So let's go ahead and get those left and right arrow keys built in. So add event. Now we want this to be a continuous thing. We don't want to have the player to tap the key every time they want to shift 5 degrees. That would be really kind of annoying. So we'll use a keyboard. We'll start off with the left arrow key. And what are we going to do? Well, we're going to change the direction of the ship. There's a couple of ways of doing this. Probably the easiest is to use the move free. So I'm going to drag over and move free. And I'm going to set the direction to direction plus 10. Remember, you can use variables inside of that variable to update the value. So I'm saying direction plus 10. I'm going to take the current value of direction, add 10 to it, and then store that value back into direction. I'm going to leave the speed at 0 because I don't want the ship to actually fly off yet. So I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm pretty much going to do the same thing for right. So add keyboard right, move free, direction -10. Now, why do we do -10 +10? Again, remember degrees on a circle. If I am moving to the left or counterclockwise, my degrees are increasing. If I am moving to the right or clockwise, then my degrees are decreasing. And we can do a quick test on that to make sure that our ship is turning correctly, which it is. And so now let's get into launching the ship. That's going to be covered with the spacebar. Now, I don't want the player just to be able to hold down the spacebar and automatically launch off of planets as they fly over them. I want the user to have to physically press the spacebar, so I am going to do a key press event for the spacebar. So key press space. Now this is where things get interesting. We're currently a ship landed. When we press the spacebar, we want to become a ship flying. We could combine all the functionality into one object. Just have a ship and then just have the ship do everything, fly and be landed. It would be much, much more complicated that way and would pretty much guarantee the use of the GameMaker scripting language to be able to handle it. It would be extremely convoluted trying to do that in the drag and drop scheme. So that's why we're splitting up the logic like this into separate objects. Well, so what do we need to do here? We need to first play a sound, of course. So we're launching, so we're going to play sound, launch, loop, false. And then we need to change our landed ship into a flying ship. And it just so happens that we have a command for that, change instance. It's this little gray square going down to this little green square right here. Now, change instance is one of those things where this should be the very last action that you do to ensure that all of your other actions get processed. So I'm going to change into a ship flying. Now, I'm going to come back to this whole perform events thing. For now, leave that on the default, perform events not. Hit OK. And actually, I skipped a step. We also have to tell the ship to start moving now. So I'm going to take the move free. I'm going to drag that in between there. I'm going to say move in direction speed of 6. Now, how does this work if I'm setting the direction and speed on the ship landed and then I'm changing into a ship flying? Well, when you change instances like this, when you change objects, all of the shared values, all of the shared variables transfer over. So all of your local built-in variables like x and y and direction and speed will remain the same. They will remain unchanged when you transfer objects. So even though I'm setting the direction and speed on ship landed, ship flying will still see those changes. Now, we can't really test this yet because ship flying doesn't do anything. There's no image to it, so yeah, that would not work. So we can't test it yet. So let's just go ahead and go into ship flying and get some things working. First thing we need to do is put in the wrap screen effect thing, because we want the ship flying to have the same behavior as the rocks and the asteroids. We can fly off one side of the screen, fly back in on the other. So add event, other, outside room, movement tab, wrap, both directions, done. We also need to do the same step event thing for its animation. So add event, step, in step, because we want to make sure that we process the left and right arrow keys. Main one, change sprite, This time we will change to a sprite flying, and the same logic, direction divided by 5 with a speed of 0. Now we need to put in steering. Steering is going to work pretty much the same way as it did with ship landed, only a lot slower. Oh, and before I forget, go ahead and assign our flying sprite to it, even though it's kind of irrelevant since we're doing this change sprite thing right here, but still a good thing to have in there. All right, so movement, add event, keyboard left. We're going to do pretty much the same thing. We're going to go back up to move, move free, direction +2. These are rickety old mail ships. These are not fighters. These are not top-line mystical alien magic tech fighters that can, fly through asteroid fields like you and I would, walk through a sparsely populated field or anything like that. These are rickety old mail ships. They don't fly all that good. And speed of 6, because we want to maintain that forward speed. And then add event, keyboard right, move free, direction. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and leave that typo in just so we can see, what it might look like having a typo in there. So yes, I know direction is currently spelled wrong. Please spell it right on your copy. And now we can test this. Can't land, can't die, but at least we can test that our flying works correctly. So it should happen. So I should be able to line up my orientation. And then when I launch, I should move in that direction, which is what happens. Now, we've got a couple of issues here. One, we forgot to destroy the speck moon when we launched. Oh, and there's my error. So, you're flying around, you can turn left all you want, then you go to try to turn right, and boom! Again, remember, parsing things. Keyboard event, right key, that tells me which event to look at. Object ship flying tells me which object to look at. And then this rather confusing line basically tells me variable get direction, meaning it could not find this variable, obviously, since it's misspelled. So abort. Oops. Spell it correct. And let's get back over to ship landed. And on the press space event, again, before this change instance, we're going to go to main 1. We're going to go to destroy instance, and we are going to destroy object spec moon. This is another reason why we need that spec moon. Remember, if we said destroy object moon, that would destroy every single moon in the room, which would absolutely not be what we want. Instead, we just want to destroy the spec moon. And so with that, now I can fly left and right. Now notice I'm going underneath the moons and asteroids. If we were supposed to be able to fly continuously, we would, as in, not explode or land, we would fix that problem, but we don't need to do that, so we're not going to fix that problem, at least not yet. So now we need to actually land the ship. So, let's see here. Oops, that ship landed. Don't want to put that on there. So for our ship flying, let's add in a collision with a moon first. So I've collided with the moon. What do I need to do? Well, the first thing I need to do is I need to change that moon into a spec moon, as I don't want it to be a regular moon anymore. So I'm going to go to main 1. I'm going to do a change instance on other. Make sure you select other. And I'm going to change it into a spec moon. perform events not. And we will deal with perform events in a future project. So change instance into a spec moon. All right. Next thing that I want to do is I want to give myself some points, or give the player some points. Now I am jumping ahead just a little bit here. The book doesn't have points going in quite yet, but we're here. Let's go ahead and put the points in. So we're going to go down to score, set score, and we're going to give the player 500 points. Make sure you check relative so that way the points get added in and not set to an absolute value. I'm also going to want to play my score sound. So going back up to main 1, sounds, sound, score, loop, false. And now that I'm pretty much done with all of my other actions, now I need to change the ship flying back into a ship landed. So a change instance into a ship landed. And now we should be able to test this. So here we go. Da, 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 da. And it would appear we've got a couple of bugs here that I've missed a checkbox on someplace. So let's go track those down. So ship landed. Pressing the space. Destroy instance spec moon. Oh yes, I know precisely which bug we are encountering right now. Our ship is still there. I'll prove it to you. But we're running into a drawing order issue. So I launch, I land, ship disappears. I launch, see, the ship was still there. And I disappear. I launch and I disappear. What's going on here? It has to do with draw ordering. You can think of drawing all of these sprites on the screen like drawing sheets of paper. Imagine that you've got 3 sheets of paper, each sheet of paper representing a sprite, and your table represents the monitor. When you go to draw the first sprite, or the first sheet of paper, you lay it down on the table, and you can see it just fine. Then when you go to draw the second sprite, or the second sheet of paper, and put it down on the table, if you put it down on top of the first sheet, you can no longer see it. Same thing with the third sprite, or the third sheet of paper. You take it, you place it down on the table, and if you place it over the first two, either of the first two, you will cover them up. That is what's going on here. The ship landed is being drawn in a different order than the ship, or than the spec moon, and is getting drawn underneath it. There's some technical reasons for it. We're not going to dig down too deep into it because it honestly doesn't matter that much. How we fix this is the depth property. The depth property refers to how deep, or how far on the bottom, is this particular object. A higher depth means deeper on the bottom. You can kind of think of it like dungeon floors going down for an RPG metaphor. Depth 0 is the town, the top floor, and depth 5 would be five levels down into the dungeon. So if we go the opposite direction, we'll be higher up. So if I change my ship landed to a depth of -1, it will always be drawn on top of something that is at depth 0. Hit F5 to test this out. And there we go. Now we're actually staying on top of the moons like we're supposed to. Well, that leaves exploding against asteroids next, but we're going to break here and put that into a separate video. This one's starting to get a little bit long. Plus, due to some of the rather severe differences between Studio and Game Maker 6, we're going to have to modify the death sequence quite a bit for this to work. So, until the next video.